Before daybreak, the scouts on the ridge above the old town saw them coming, a war party, moving up the trail in the dark, more of them than the town could answer. The people of Nikwasi were already losing. The enemy had burned its way through village after village in the valleys below, and now it was climbing into the mountains toward the mother of the middle towns, and there were not enough warriors left standing to hold the ground. Then a stranger appeared on the trail, a chief, by his dress and his speech, and behind him a company of fighting men no one recognized. The Nikwasi people took them for reinforcements come up from the overhill settlements in Tennessee, and they fell back toward the townhouse to let the newcomers pass. And as they came near the mound, they saw where the strangers were coming from, not down the trail, out of the mound itself. Out of the side of the earth, as through an open doorway, warrior after warrior. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Until the hillside seemed to empty men into the daylight. That was when the Nikwasi knew who had come to fight for them, the Nunyeyi, the immortals, the people who live anywhere. No one had ever heard, before that morning, that they lived under the Nikwasi mound, but there they were, pouring out of it, and by the end of the day the enemy was broken and the town still stood. An old man told that story to a government man with a notebook, sometime in the late 1880s, in the mountains of western North Carolina. The old man's name was Swimmer. The government man wrote it down almost word for word, and years later he printed it, and because he printed it we still have it. But sit with the shape of that story for a second, because it is stranger than a ghost tale, a town in trouble, a mound, and an older people, already inside the mound, who come out of it to decide the fight. The Cherokee did not tell the man with the notebook that the mound was a heap of dirt. They told him it was inhabited. They told him who lived in it. And, in a roundabout way, they told him something that a great many powerful people in the United States had, only 50 years earlier, spent enormous energy insisting could not possibly be true. They told him who built the mounds, and they told him, sometimes, that it was not their own fathers. The man with the notebook was named James Mooney. He was born in Richmond, Indiana, to Irish Catholic immigrants, and he had almost no formal schooling past high school. What he had instead was an obsession. As a boy, he taught himself the names of tribes and where they lived, and he kept lists, and he wrote letters, and in 1885 he talked his way into a job at the Bureau of American Ethnology under John Wesley Powell, the one-armed Colorado River explorer who ran the Young Science of American Anthropology out of the Smithsonian. For 2 years Mooney did office work. Then, in the summer of 1887, he went south into the Great Smoky Mountains, to the eastern band of the Cherokee, and he began the work that would define his life. Understand who the eastern band were, because it matters to everything that follows. They were the ones who stayed. When the United States drove the Cherokee Nation west in the winter of 1838 and 1839, some hundreds of Cherokee families in the North Carolina mountains held on, in the coves and along the rivers, on land too steep and too remote and too legally tangled to be worth the army's trouble. They were the remnant of a removal. And 50 years later, when Mooney climbed into those same mountains, he was walking among people who had watched the machinery of dispossession come through their homeland and had somehow survived it in place. That is who was telling him the stories. His method was unusual for the time, and it is the reason his books still matter. He did not paraphrase and improve. He learned the Cherokee language. He sat with the oldest keepers of the tradition and wrote down what they said, as closely as he could get it, in their words and not his. His central informant was that old medicine man, Swimmer, whose Cherokee name was Ayunyin. Swimmer could neither read nor write English, but he kept a notebook of his own, roughly 240 pages of prayers and songs and charms and cures, written in the Cherokee syllabary that a silversmith named Sequoia had invented within living memory. It was, Mooney said, an entire ritual and pharmacopoeia of a people, kept in a script that was younger than the man writing in it. Mooney published the first fruit of that work in 1891, The Sacred Formulas of the Cherokees. Then, in 1900, in the 19th annual report of the Bureau, he printed the big one, Myths of the Cherokee. 126 stories, gathered mostly between 1,887 and 1,890, from the mouths of people who were the last unbroken link to a world the United States had tried very hard to erase. So when we ask what the Cherokee told James Mooney about the mounds, we are not dealing with rumour. We are dealing with the closest thing the historical record has to a direct transcript. And what they told him begins with the mound as a living thing, not a monument to the dead. Start with Kituwa. If you ask a Cherokee where the people come from, a great many of them will point you to a low green rise beside the Tuckasegee River, a few miles from Bryson City, North Carolina. Kituwa is the mother town. It is the original community, the fire from which all the other town fires were said to be lit, the place all Cherokee everywhere could name as home, even when they lived 100 miles away. A Cherokee man in the 1600s, living as far off as the Mississippi, might still call himself a man of Kituwa. The mound there is not tall. Today it stands about 5 feet high and roughly 170 feet across, but it was not built to be looked at, it was built to be used. On top of that mound stood the townhouse, the great council house, and inside the council house burned the sacred fire, the eternal flame that the medicine keepers were charged with, never letting die. The mound was the foundation of the town's civic and religious life, all at once. It was the courthouse, and the church, and the parliament, and the hearth, raised up on an earthen platform, so that the fire at the centre of the people sat at the centre of the ground. When you understand that, the mounds stop being mysterious hills, and become exactly what they look like when you stop expecting a pyramid. They are the raised floors of buildings, they are architecture, and they were made, basket load, by people who lived there. Then there is Nikwasi, where our story opened, near what is now Franklin, North Carolina. Its name means the Star Place. Like Kituwa, it was a mother of the middle towns, a white town, which in the Cherokee world meant a town of peace rather than war. It too carried the townhouse and the everlasting fire on its summit. It too sat on a river, tied by water to a chain of other towns strung through the valleys like beads. And it was into that mound, the Cherokee told Mooney, that the Noonien had their townhouse, their own council fire under the earth, so that on the right kind of morning you might see the smoke of it rising from the top of the hill. The Noonien were not the little people, the Yunwitsunsdi, the small spirits of the woods. The Noonien were full-sized. They looked like anyone. They lived under the mounds and under certain mountains and beneath the deep pools of the rivers, and they were the friends and protectors of the Cherokee. There was a story of them on the Hiwassee, where a whole town of ordinary people was taken down under the water to live among them and become immortal, and where, on warm summer days when the wind rippled the surface, you could still hear them talking below, and where fishermen whose drags snagged the bottom understood it as the touch of lost kinsmen who did not want to be forgotten. There was a townhouse of theirs said to be inside Pilot Knob, and there was the morning at Nikwasi, when they came out of the mound and won a battle that the living could not. The Cherokee told Mooney of a later day, too, when another army came burning up the valley, generations on, and the town was spared a second time by a defence the attackers could never quite account for, as though the hill still kept its garrison. Whether you take that as memory or as metaphor, the meaning the Cherokee attached to it never wavered. The mound was not a grave, it was a garrison. Something lived there, and it was on their side. Now hold those two things side by side. The Cherokee told Mooney, plainly, that their own ancestors built and used the mounds, raised the townhouses on them, and kept the sacred fire there. And the Cherokee also told him, in the same breath sometimes, that the mounds were inhabited by an older people who were already there, an immortal people who lived inside the earth before and beneath the living town. Both things are in the record. The builders were their fathers, and the deepest occupants in the telling were someone else. That is not a contradiction the Cherokee needed to resolve. It is only a contradiction to us, because we came to the mounds with a very specific question and a very specific answer we had been trained to want. Because there was another tradition Mooney wrote down, and this is the one the title of tonight's story is pointing at. The Cherokee spoke of a people who lived in the country before them, a people who could not see well in the daytime, who moved and fought at night, whose eyes were suited to the dark. The moon-eyed people. The Cherokee said they found them already in the land and drove them out of it, westward, generations before the Europeans ever arrived. In the mountains there is an old stone wall on Fort Mountain in North Georgia, and somewhere in the last century the moon-eyed people and that wall got married together in the popular imagination, the wall becoming their fortification. That pairing is younger than it sounds. It seems to have hardened only in the early 1900s. But the tradition of an earlier people, an odd people, a people whose works you might find lying about the country when you arrived, that tradition Mooney genuinely recorded. And here is where an honest storyteller has to slow down, because this is exactly the seam where truth and a very old lie run right up against each other. James Mooney was a careful man for his era, but he was a man of his era. When he handled the moon-eyed people, he did not say they were white men, or Welshmen, or Phoenicians, or a lost tribe of anything. He recorded the Cherokee account and left it standing. But he lived and wrote inside a moment when respectable American science was flirting hard with an idea that had nothing careful about it at all. The idea that a vanished race, older and greater than the Indians, had built the mounds, and that the Indians we could see were merely squatters camped in the ruins of a civilization they had destroyed and could never have made. That idea has a name now, the mound builder myth, and for most of the 19th century it was not a fringe belief. It was close to the American consensus. You have to picture the scale of what these people were looking at, because the earthworks are genuinely staggering, and it was the very grandeur of them that the myth fed on. Down the Ohio and the Mississippi, and across the southeast, there were tens of thousands of mounds. There were geometric enclosures at Newark in Ohio, circles and octagons laid out across acres with a precision that tracked the movements of the moon across an 18-year cycle. There was Cahokia, near present-day Street. Louis, where a single earthen pyramid, Monk's Mound, covered a footprint larger than the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza, at the heart of a city that in its day was larger than London. There was the Serpent Mound coiling across a ridge in Ohio. And here, in the Cherokee country, there was Etowah, on the Etowah River in Georgia, the most intact Mississippian town site left in the southeast. Its great platform mound rising above a plaza that was the capital of a chiefdom at its height around 1350. Faced with all of that, a great many educated white Americans decided, more or less on purpose, that the ancestors of the people they were in the process of removing could not have done it. Somebody grander must have. A lost race. Perhaps giants, and there were newspaper reports of enormous skeletons pulled from the mounds to prove it, most of which dissolved on inspection or were never seen by anyone reliable. Perhaps a wandering band of Israelites, or Egyptians, or Europeans blown off course 1,000 years before Columbus. Anyone, in short, except the Indians. Ask the obvious question. Why would a country full of intelligent people work so hard to believe something so flattering to strangers and so insulting to their neighbors? And the answer is the reason this is an economic history and not a ghost story. The lost race myth was worth money. It was worth a great deal of money. Because if the Indians had not built the mounds, if the Indians were themselves latecomers who had overrun and exterminated the true civilized founders of the continent, then the Indians had no deeper claim to the ground than the settlers did. Then clearing them off was not theft. It was almost restoration. You were not taking a homeland from its makers. You were reclaiming a ruined country from the descendants of its destroyers. The myth did not just excuse removal, it rewrote removal as justice. And nowhere did that arithmetic pay off faster or dirtier than in the Cherokee country, in the very decade the mounds were being argued about. In the summer of 1829, a notice ran in a Milledgeville, Georgia newspaper. Gold. There was gold in the North Georgia mountains, on the Chestatee and the streams around what would become the town of Dahlonega. The name Dahlonega comes straight from the Cherokee word for yellow, for the color of the metal, and the trouble, for the state of Georgia, was that the gold was on Cherokee land. Sovereign Cherokee land, held by a nation with its own written constitution, its own capital at New Echota, and from 1828, its own newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, printed in parallel columns of English and of Sequoia's syllabary, the first native newspaper in the country. None of that slowed the miners down. The Cherokee had a name for what came over the mountains. They called it, before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The great intrusion. Thousands of men poured onto the land, afoot and on horseback and in wagons, acting, one of the first prospectors remembered, more like crazy men than anything else. Boomtowns went up almost overnight. Auraria, in the heart of the diggings, had 1,000 people in it by 1832, a town conjured out of a stream bed on ground that belonged, by treaty and by the Cherokee's own long residence, to somebody else entirely. And the state of Georgia, rather than remove the trespassers from a sovereign nation's territory, decided to remove the nation instead. The mechanism was a lottery. Georgia had been doing this for a generation, running land lotteries to hand out ground seized from the Creeks and the Cherokee, and now it aimed the machine at the gold fields. Surveyors went out across the Cherokee country and cut it into squares, ordinary land districts of 160 acres. And in the gold region, smaller lots of 40 acres each, because at 40 acres to the winner you could distribute the auriferous ground to more voters. This was the gold lottery of 1832, authorized while the survey chains were still being dragged across cornfields and town sites and, yes, across mounds. A 3-year resident of Georgia could enter. A winner paid a $10 grant fee and took title to a piece of a country that was not Georgia's to give. Nearly 3/4 of the entire state was handed out this way. The homeland of a nation converted into raffle tickets. The Cherokee did the thing they had been told for years to do. They went to the law, and at first the highest door in the country was shut in their faces. In 1831, in Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, the Supreme Court declined to hear the case on its merits at all, with Chief Justice Marshall describing the tribe as a domestic dependent nation, something less than a foreign state, a ward in the care of a guardian that was at that very moment busy robbing it. It was a defeat, but it left a crack in the wall, and the next year the Cherokee drove a second case straight through it. They took Georgia back to the Supreme Court of the United States, and astonishingly they won. In 1832, in Worcester versus Georgia, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct, sovereign community, that Georgia's laws had no force inside its borders, and that the whole apparatus of seizure was unconstitutional. It was a total legal victory. And it was worth nothing at all, because President Andrew Jackson simply declined to enforce it. The court had spoken, and the executive shrugged, and the lottery drawings went ahead. The end came through a document that most of the Cherokee never signed. In December of 1835, a small faction, perhaps 19 men, gathered at New Echota and put their names to a treaty ceding every acre of Cherokee land in the southeast in exchange for territory in the west and a cash payment. The principal chief, John Ross, and the great majority of the nation rejected it. The United States chose to treat it as binding anyway. And in the winter of 1838 and 1839, General Winfield Scott's soldiers rounded the Cherokee into stockades and marched some 17,000 of them 1,000 miles west. Something like 4,000 of them, 1 in 5, died on the way. The Cherokee call it the road where they cried. We call it the Trail of Tears. And to see the whole machine in one image, look at what the United States built at Dahlonega in 1838, the same year the removal began. A federal branch mint, right there on the gold fields, on the ground taken from the people whose word for the yellow metal had given the town its name. The government opened a facility whose entire purpose was to stamp that gold into coin. The homeland became a lottery, the lottery became a gold field, and the gold field got its own mint, all inside 10 years, all resting on the legal fiction that this ground had never really belonged to the people being marched off of it. That is the world the lost race myth served. It was the story that made the paperwork feel clean. Now, in fairness, and because the honest version is always the stronger one, the myth did not go unchallenged inside science itself, and it did not survive. The same Bureau of American Ethnology that employed James Mooney had, a few years before his Cherokee books, settled the question with a shovel. Under a man named Cyrus Thomas, the Bureau ran a vast survey of the mounds through the 1880s, digging and measuring and cataloguing across the whole eastern country precisely to test the lost race idea. Thomas began, by his own account, a believer in the vanished race. He ended, in his enormous report of 1,894, forced to the opposite conclusion. The mounds were built by the ancestors of the Indians who were living beside them. There was no lost race. The alleged proofs of one, the giant skeletons, the inscribed tablets, the out-of-place relics, were a mixture of wishful reading and outright forgery, and one by one they were exposed as such through those same years. The science, when it finally did its homework, agreed with what the Cherokee had been saying all along. But notice the timing, because the timing is the whole point. The Smithsonian did not correct the record until the 1890s. The removal it helped excuse was finished by 1839. The truth arrived more than half a century after the land was already gone, the gold already coined, the nation already marched into the territory that would become Oklahoma. The lie did its work, collected its wages, and only then was quietly retired. By the time the official verdict caught up with the facts, there was nothing left for the verdict to protect. And that is the deeper reason James Mooney's notebook matters so much, because when he climbed into the Smoky Mountains in 1887, he was walking straight into the living rebuttal of the myth, and he had the sense to write down what it said. He was sitting with the descendants of the mound builders, not a lost race, not giants. The eastern band of the Cherokee, keeping the memory of Kituwa and Nikwasi, describing the townhouses that had stood on the mounds and the sacred fire that had burned there, telling him the mounds were the raised hearts of their towns, telling him their own people had carried the baskets that raised them. The very thing a nation had paid so dearly to deny, a wrinkled medicine man named Swimmer was reciting into a Bureau of American Ethnology field book, for free, because Mooney had bothered to learn the language and ask. And even the harder tradition, the one that seems at first to support the myth, does not actually hand it over. Yes, the Cherokee spoke of the moon-eyed people, of an earlier folk in the land before them. But an earlier native people is not a lost white civilization. The southeast was old and peopled and layered, long before any one modern nation's story begins. Archaeologists today are careful about this in a way the myth never was. When they say a great site like Etowah is Mississippian, they are naming a period, roughly 1000 to 1600, and a way of life, not a single tribe. Etowah is claimed as ancestral ground by the Muskogee Creek and revered by the Cherokee both, because the map of who lived where shifted across centuries, and towns changed hands, and peoples moved and merged and split. So it can be entirely true that a given Cherokee town's fathers did not personally raise a given ancient mound, and still be entirely false that some vanished master race did. The builders were always native. The only question was which native people, in which century. The moon-eyed story is a memory of that depth and movement. It is not a confession that the Indians were interlopers. The myth took a real, complicated, indigenous past and flattened it into a single, convenient absence. None of this means the stories are simple history you can lift out of the ground with a trowel. They are not. Oral traditions carry meaning forward far more faithfully than they carry dates, and serious scholars are right to be careful before reading any myth as a survey map. Some have even argued that pieces of what Mooney gathered had shifted or grown in the century before he ever wrote them down. Fair enough. But caution about the fine detail is a very different thing from the wholesale erasure the myth performed. You can doubt whether a given tale pins a given mound to a given century, and still see, plainly, that the people telling the tales understood the mounds as their own inheritance, and not as the leavings of some superior stranger who had come and gone, which is why the mound at Nikwasi being inhabited is, in the end, the truest image in the whole account. The Cherokee never described an empty ruin waiting for a better people to explain it. They described a mound with a fire on top and a people inside, occupied above and occupied below. The exact opposite of the myth's central claim, which was that these earthworks were monuments to an absence, headstones for a race that was gone. The Cherokee said, "No one is gone. The town is here, and the old ones are still in the hill, and on the right morning they come out." You can go and stand on that argument today, and the argument is still going. Kituwa, the mother town, the green rise by the Tuckasegee, spent most of the last 2 centuries as somebody's farm. After the cessions that stripped the Cherokee of the valley around 1820, the mother town of an entire people became a field in a single family's hands, ploughed for 176 years, a place they called Ferguson's Field. And every one of those seasons of ploughing shaved a little more off the top of the mound, dragging it down from the 15 or 20 feet it once stood to the 5 feet that is left. The most sacred ground the Cherokee have, worn down by the blade of a plough because it had passed, on paper, into other hands. And Kituwa's slow erosion was not even unusual. All across the eastern country, mounds were levelled outright, scraped flat for farmland and for city streets. Wherever a growing town wanted the ground they stood on, the earth of them carted away as fill. A monument you have decided nobody built is a very easy thing to bulldoze. Then, in 1996, the Eastern Band bought it back. 309 acres, the valley and the worn-down mound at the centre of it, in what was the tribe's first major land purchase in more than a century. A survey the next year found a village site 65 acres across, and the graves of what may be 1,000 or more of their ancestors. They put the ground into trust, and they named it, formally, a sacred site, and they began farming it again, this time as their own, growing corn in the shadow of the mother mound, and the fight for it did not end there. In 2009, an energy company began clearing a ridge overlooking Kituwa to build a $52 million electrical substation without meaningfully consulting the tribe, on a viewshed that had held the mother town sky for thousands of years. A grassroots movement rose almost overnight, Cherokee from the Eastern Band and the Cherokee Nation and the United Kituwa Band together under a single banner, Save Kituwa. By the summer of 2010, the company backed down and moved the project. The same story, one more time. An outside interest, a valuation, a piece of land priced as if the past on it were worth nothing, and the descendants of the mound builders standing on the mound to say otherwise. So circle all the way back to the morning we started with, the scouts on the ridge, the town about to fall, and the warriors coming out of the side of the mound to save it. For 100 years, official America told itself that the mounds were empty, empty of makers, empty of meaning, empty of any claim strong enough to slow a survey chain or stop a lottery. That emptiness was the product. It was surveyed, it was drawn, it was raffled off in 40-acre squares, and it was stamped into gold coins at a mint on the gold fields. Emptiness, it turned out, was the most valuable commodity the whole young republic ever put up at auction. The whole apparatus ran on the idea that no one who mattered had ever really lived here. And an old man named Swimmer, who could not read the language of the people who had written that idea into law, sat in a mountain cabin and told a note-taking stranger the plainest possible rebuttal. The mounds were never empty. Our fathers built them, and the old ones live in them, and they come out when the town is in danger. It took the United States government's own scientists until the 1890s to admit the first half of that sentence was simply true. The second half, the part about who is still inside the hill, was never theirs to confirm or deny. That belongs to Kituwa and to the people who bought their mother town back one ploughed acre at a time. The real buried civilization was never a phantom. It was never a lost race of giants or sailors or kings from across the sea. It was standing right next to the mound the whole time, speaking a language a man from Indiana had to learn before he could hear it, telling him exactly who built the earth he was standing on and exactly who still lived beneath it. Make of that what you will.